Clara stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, staring at the stone house as if it might speak first. The air was sharp with early spring cold, and the gray clouds above pressed low like a weight. The house, nestled between wind-worn trees and overgrown hedges, looked as though it had been holding its breath for decades. Its windows were dark, reflective, not broken, just watchful. The paint on the door had peeled back to the wood beneath, and ivy clung like veins around the edges of the frame. She hadn't been here since she was 12. Memories came in foggy fragments. A warm voice, the smell of cinnamon tea, a scratchy red armchair. Her grandmother's presence lingered in faint, involuntary echoes. But this house didn't feel familiar now. It felt like something that had grown teeth in the years since her absence. Clara ran a hand through her shoulder-length brown hair, her fingers brushing the back of her neck as she approached the entrance. The iron key was heavy in her coat pocket. She unlocked the front door, and it creaked open with a slow, exhaling groan. The interior was colder than outside, and the scent of old wood and dust flooded her senses. The furniture remained where it had always been. Nothing had changed, but everything felt altered. A heaviness hung in the air, not a neglect, but memory, as if the walls had spent the years whispering to one another in her absence. She moved through the hallway, her boots clicking softly on the warped wooden floor. A framed photograph sat on a table near the staircase, her grandmother younger, standing with a man Clara didn't recognize. Beside it, a candle had long burned down to a stub. She exhaled through her nose, steadying herself. This was just a house. Stone, wood, and history. Still, something tugged at her stomach like a warning. Later that evening, after unpacking boxes and forcing herself through a lukewarm microwave dinner, Clara climbed the attic stairs to explore. The door groaned open stiffly, revealing a room full of dust and forgotten things. A broken rocking horse, a box of yellow postcards, shelves of brittle books, and in the far corner, a section of wall covered in wallpaper that didn't match the rest, floral, vibrant, suspiciously untouched. She made a mental note to inspect it later. For now, exhaustion pulled at her bones. That night, Clara lay beneath thick, unfamiliar blankets in her childhood room, listening to the silence, except it wasn't silent. There was a soft clicking sound from the hallway. She sat up. Floorboards creaked lightly, one after the other, as if someone were walking, slowly. But the footsteps stopped just before her door. Her breath caught in her throat. She waited. Nothing. Clara forced a laugh, thin and hollow, and shook her head. It was an old house. Wood shifted. Pipes settled. She closed her eyes, determined not to fall into paranoia on her first night. But just as sleep finally crept in, a faint sound stirred her again, a soft voice humming. A child's voice, low, melodic, and distant. It came from above her, from the attic. Clara woke before sunrise, the eerie melody from the night still playing faintly in her ears. She sat up in bed, heart beating in steady pulses as the early light filtered through the thin curtains. Had it been a dream? The kind that slips between memory and imagination, so smoothly you can't tell where it started? She rubbed her eyes and tried to dismiss the strange tension in her chest. Houses creaked. Sometimes sounds echoed, and maybe she'd imagined the humming. Still, something about the attic wall, the unmatched wallpaper, clung to her thoughts like a thorn under the skin. By mid-morning, after pacing the kitchen and finishing a cup of lukewarm coffee, Clara headed upstairs, toolbox in hand. The attic was cold, despite the sun warming the roof outside. She crossed the room slowly, her breath visible in the air. The wallpapered section stood out even more now, bright roses and ivy woven into faded green, almost unnaturally preserved. She touched it. The surface felt newer than the rest. Peeling back one corner carefully, she exposed the crumbling wall behind it. Beneath a thin layer of plaster, her knuckles struck something hollow. Wood. A panel, with slow precision. She pried the wall open, revealing a narrow cavity no wider than a suitcase. Inside, a small, dust-covered object lay wrapped in a yellowing linen cloth. Clara knelt, pulling it free. It was a diary, bound in cracked leather and tied with a faded ribbon. Her breath caught. A name had been etched faintly on the first page in looping script. Elise bound. She flipped through the pages, careful not to tear them. The entries began in 1943. The handwriting was small, neat, written in ink that had browned with age. Elise was around 10, based on her descriptions, a girl with chestnut hair and green eyes, hidden in the attic for her safety. Clara sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, transfixed. The entries were vivid, personal, intimate. Elise wrote about the sounds of bombings in the distance, the taste of the stale bread she was fed, and the games she played alone with wooden buttons. But there was something else, something darker. They told me I had to be quiet. I was good. I was so quiet. But sometimes the house makes noises, and they say it's me. Yesterday, someone locked the door from outside. I called for hours. No one came. Clara paused, a chill creeping over her. She glanced back at the small cavity in the wall. This was no hiding spot. It was a cell. As she read on, her skin prickled. Elise described a day when the lights went out, and she was left alone in the dark. She scratched tally marks into the wall to count the days, though they often blended together. There was no mention of her ever leaving. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She left the diary on the kitchen table and sat near the fireplace, staring into the cold hearth, the flickering glow of her phone screen casting shadows across the room. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the silence broke again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a knock, soft, deliberate, from upstairs. 3 knocks. Clara stood, heart in her throat. She tiptoed to the base of the staircase and looked up. Nothing moved. But on the top step, something small lay in the darkness. A single wooden button, old and worn smooth. Clara didn't move. The wooden button sat still, silent and perfectly round, as if it had been placed with care. The air around her had thickened again, heavy like fog, but without the moisture. Just weight, a pressure that made her ears ring faintly, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting. Slowly, she climbed the stairs. Each step creaked softly, betraying her movements. At the top, she crouched to pick up the button. It was smaller than she expected, maybe from a child's coat. It smelled faintly of smoke and dust. As she turned it over in her hand, a soft breeze passed down the hall. Though no windows were open, she turned toward the attic. The door was ajar. Clara hadn't left it that way. Fingers trembling, she pushed it open, the hinges letting out a long, aching moan. The attic looked unchanged, boxes undisturbed, shadows intact. Yet, something felt different, warmer, almost, not welcoming, but occupied. She stepped inside and immediately noticed the diary was missing. Her pulse quickened. She had left it downstairs on the table. As if in response, a soft tap-tap echoed behind her. She spun around. Nothing. But then again, tap-tap, this time louder behind the far wall. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't mice. It was a rhythm, deliberate. She backed out, pulling the door shut, and hurried down the stairs, trying to think logically. Old houses made noise, sometimes even hallucinatory sounds, when someone was overtired and overstressed. She'd read about it, auditory pareidolia. But when she reached the kitchen, her breath caught. The diary was sitting in the middle of the table, closed, exactly where she had left it. Clara stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Something inside her rebelled against the idea of continuing. But curiosity, and something deeper, a quiet responsibility, urged her forward. She opened again. The entries were different. New handwriting, similar, but more rushed. The ink fresher. The house remembers everything, even the things people try to forget. They said I was dangerous, that if I stayed too long, I'd bring the memories back. It's not me haunting them. It's what they did. Clara's hands trembled as she read. She flipped through more pages, skimming snippets of thoughts. Elise was losing her grip or being lost by someone else. Her fear was not of ghosts or war, but abandonment. A few lines stood alone, written shakily. I screamed until my voice broke. Then I stopped making noise. That's when the house started making noise instead. As the words settled into her chest, Clara felt the cold bloom again, not around her, but within her. Something inside the house had absorbed that pain, that memory, and was still playing it back, like a broken record stuck on the same track for decades. Suddenly, the lights above her flickered. Once, twice, then out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint blue glow of her phone on the counter. Clara stood frozen, trying to steady her breath. In the black silence, she heard a familiar sound. Humming, the same soft melody from the night before. But now it was clearer and closer, coming from behind the wall in the living room. She stepped forward. Phone flashlight flicked on. The beam of light quivered with her movement, sweeping across the faded wallpaper and time-worn photos hanging askew. The humming grew louder as she approached the far wall, where an old bookshelf stood. Without thinking, she reached out and ran her hand along the edge, and the humming stopped. A sharp creak split the silence. The bookshelf shifted slightly, as though on hinges. She leaned in. Behind it, she saw the outline of a narrow door. Clara pushed the shelf aside with effort, revealing the hidden frame. The door was old, the paint cracked, the handle rusted. As she reached for it, a rush of cold air spilled through the tiny gap beneath, chilling her ankles. She turned the handle. It clicked open. The door revealed a narrow corridor with paneling and exposed stone. Dust floated like ash in the flashlight beam. The walls were lined with shallow shelves, empty and lifeless, except for one. A single button rested there. Next to it, a lock of chestnut hair, tied with ribbon. Clara stepped back, heart pounding. Behind her, faint and layered over the silence, she heard it again. Whispers, dozens of them, all around, pressed between the walls. Some crying, some singing, some just breathing. She stumbled back through the door, shutting it quickly. The whispers didn't follow. But she knew now, they weren't just memories trapped in the house. They were witnesses. And something, or someone, wanted her to hear what they'd heard, see what they'd seen. Clara looked down at the diary still in her hands. The page had changed again. New words were being written right now, in real time. You found me. Now don't stop. Clara stared at the words bleeding into the diary's page, watching each letter form as if written by invisible hands. The air around her felt charged, as if the house had shifted its weight and leaned forward, no longer indifferent but aware. She slammed the book shut instinctively, her heart thudding in her chest. Her reflection in the kitchen window caught her eye, pale, shaken, and barely holding the threads of reason. She needed answers, not just to what the house was, but who Elise really was, what happened to her, and why these memories were surfacing now, after so many years of silence. By noon, Clara had combed through every drawer in the study, every storage box tucked into closets. Amid stacks of bills and yellowed photographs, she found a small, leather-bound ledger in her grandmother's handwriting. Inside were dates, lists of tenants, repairs, and one note circled several times in red ink. Do not open basement. Keep locked. Reinforced door. Her stomach dropped. The basement. She hadn't even noticed the door. Fueled by both dread and determination, Clara moved through the house slowly, scanning the baseboard and corners until she found it. An old, metal door partially concealed behind a heavy bookshelf in the study. It had been painted the same color as the wall, clearly meant to blend in. A thick iron lock held it shut, rusted but sturdy. Clara retrieved a set of old keys she'd seen in the kitchen drawer and tried them one by one. The third clicked. The door creaked open with resistance, releasing a breath of air that smelled of damp earth and metal. A steep staircase disappeared into darkness. The light switch on the wall didn't work. She raised her phone's flashlight again and descended, step by step, with groaning under her feet. The basement was larger than she expected. Not unfinished, but forgotten. Stone walls lined the perimeter, slick with condensation. In the center, surrounded by scattered wooden crates, was what appeared to be a trapdoor, bound shut by iron latches. Her instinct screamed at her to leave it alone. Instead, she moved closer. As she bent to inspect it, a sharp, sudden sound pierced the silence, a scream, faint and high-pitched, as if heard through water or time. She stumbled back, clutching her chest, heart racing. The sound was gone as fast as it came, but it had come from beneath the trapdoor. Fighting the swell of panic, Clara searched the shelves until she found a crowbar. She wedged it beneath the latch and heaved. The metal resisted groaned, then gave way with a wrenching snap. The trapdoor lifted. Beneath it lay a narrow, ladder-lined shaft, leading into a tunnel of carved stone. Cold air rose from the depths, and with it, the unmistakable scent of rotting fabric and dust. She hesitated, the weight of every horror story she'd ever heard pressing down on her shoulders, then descended. The tunnel walls were smooth, almost unnaturally so, carved with strange etchings that resembled tally marks. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They lined the entire passage. At the end was a small room, barely larger than a closet. The flashlight illuminated the contents in fragments. A broken doll, a rusted tin cup, and carved into the wall in large, deliberate letters. I remember everything. Clara stepped back, her breath shaking. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a grave. The realization struck hard, anchoring itself in her chest. She dropped to her knees, overcome not by fear, but sorrow, a tidal wave of it crashing down, stealing her breath. This little space, so cruelly cut off from light and sound, was where Elise had spent her final days. Forgotten, silenced, buried alive by those who had claimed to protect her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her hand, a soft vibration persistent. She looked down. The screen was blank. No calls, no texts. Then, a single line of text appeared across the display, as if typed by unseen fingers. "You found me." The phone flickered, then died, and from the darkness behind her, a quiet voice spoke. I didn't want to be alone. Clara spun around. Nothing but shadows. The voice again, closer now and unmistakably real. They said I would forget, but I never did. I never did. Clara backed up, tears brimming in her eyes. Elise! Silence. Then, breath against her ear, warm and cold all at once. Will you remember me? Clara's knees gave out, and she sat heavily against a stone wall, overwhelmed by grief and the enormity of what she'd uncovered. Yes, she whispered. I will. For a moment, everything stilled. The weight in the air lifted slightly, and the silence returned. But not the heavy, oppressive kind. This was something else. Relief. She climbed back up the ladder, sealing the trapdoor behind her. Back in the kitchen, she opened the diary once more. The ink was fresh. Thank you. I can rest now. But the house remembers everything. As Clara closed the book, something within her shifted. This wasn't just about Elise anymore. This house, her family, had buried a memory alive, and that act had left a scar deep in its walls, in its bones. She thought about leaving, selling the place, burning it to the ground. But she knew in her gut that this house still had more to say, and she wasn't finished listening. The next morning, Clara stood in front of the attic window, watching fog roll across the yard like waves of smoke. The house was quiet again, not peaceful, but calm, a stillness that felt like exhaustion after a long cry. Something had been released the night before, but in its place, a different kind of presence lingered. Not Elise, something older. Clara clutched the diary to her chest. The entries had stopped. No new handwriting, no shifting ink. But the final message echoed in her mind. The house remembers everything. What else had it seen? She thought of the tally marks carved into the walls of the tunnel, the etchings lining the corridor like silent confessions. Elise's tragedy wasn't isolated. That space had been used before her, and probably after. She descended to the study and pulled open the old ledger again, her fingers scanning through the entries her grandmother had written. She found a set of names she hadn't noticed before. Entries scribbled in rushed ink, many crossed out. Next to one name, Louisa March, there was a strange note. Returned child. No record. Sealed per agreement. Another entry, dated 2 years earlier. Miriam Vale, behavior worsening. Requested containment. Clara's breath caught. Containment. She flipped further, heart pounding. More names. More notes. Phrases like unstable, not safe, and recommended quiet. Over and over, all connected to young women, all handled to what her grandmother had chillingly labeled as internal family care. These weren't records of tenants. They were cover-ups. A pattern emerged. Generations of women, daughters, nieces, cousins, hidden away, silenced, tucked behind the walls of the house when their grief, defiance, or trauma became inconvenient. Clara's stomach turned. The house wasn't just haunted by Elisa's memory. It was built on this legacy of erasure. She looked around the room. The ornate trim, the dusty portraits, the ancestral furniture polished with age. Suddenly, it all felt rotten. This wasn't a home. It was a mask, a beautiful facade stretched over something deeply wrong. Clara's phone buzzed. A voicemail. She hesitated before playing it. There was no number, just static and then a faint, distorted voice. "You're close. Don't stop now." The voice wasn't Elisa's. It was older, cracked, masculine. She dropped the phone. A memory surfaced, one she had buried for years. Her grandfather, always stern and distant, had once told her, "Curiosity ruins the bloodline." She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. She had just laughed, thinking it was an old man's bitterness. Now it sounded like a warning. Clara stormed into the library, searching through the hidden compartments and drawers. Behind a false panel in the fireplace, she discovered an old photograph, faded, sepia-toned. 5 girls stood in front of the house, each with solemn expressions. One of them looked eerily like Elise. On the back was a single word, etched in tight cursive, "Daughters." All unnamed. She flipped the image over again and again, but the silence of their eyes remained. Clara knew these weren't just forgotten children. They had been intentionally erased. Her grandmother had always spoken of family pride, of discipline and respect. Now, Clara could see the cost. Her ancestors had twisted love into control, compassion into fear, and the house had watched it all. She returned to the hidden corridor behind the bookshelf, heart pounding. The narrow passage seemed to throb with energy, not malicious, but desperate. It wanted to be understood, to be acknowledged. Inside, she placed her hand on the shelf where the lock of hair and button once rested. They were gone now, but a new object had taken their place. A small mirror. The surface was fogged, but as Clara wiped it clean, her reflection shifted. Behind her, just for a flash, stood the 5 girls from the photograph, their eyes wide, mouths closed, waiting. She turned, but the corridor was empty. When she looked back, words had appeared on the mirror's surface, written in reverse. "Finish what they started. Set us free." Her breath trembled in her chest. The house wasn't just showing her the past. It was begging her to confront it. That night, she gathered candles and returned to the tunnel. She lit them along the walls, filling the space with warm, flickering light. Then she sat in the center of the room and opened the diary one last time. She began to write, not Elisa's story, not her grandmother's, but all of them, every name, every record, every hidden life she could find in the ledger. She transcribed them carefully, deliberately, as if speaking them back into existence. As she wrote, the air around her began to shift. The walls sighed, the house groaned, and then she heard it. Voices, hundreds, not crying, not whispering, thanking her. A sudden warmth spread across her shoulders, as if hands had gently rested there in gratitude. The candle flames flared, then stilled. The house felt lighter, not cured, but relieved, like a wound had been acknowledged after festering too long in silence. When Clara emerged from the tunnel, the air was crisp. Morning sunlight pierced through the windows for the first time in days. The kitchen smelled of lavender and old wood. No rot, no mold. She looked at the diary. It was full now. The final page held a new line in neat, final handwriting. "Now we are remembered." She closed the book gently, and for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like she was trespassing. She felt invited. The silence that followed felt different. Not the thick, oppressive quiet that had haunted the house since Clara arrived, but a peaceful kind, like the hush that follows the final note of a requiem. The walls no longer creaked under invisible weight. The air smelled of dust and dawn. Something in the house had shifted. Something had let go. Clara sat on the front porch steps, the diary resting in her lap, its pages fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. The sun was low in the sky, cutting gold across the overgrown lawn. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe without bracing for what might be watching her. The dread was gone, not replaced by comfort, exactly, but by clarity. She wasn't afraid anymore. The house still stood behind her, the same creaking wood, the same ivy-covered walls, but now it felt less like a haunted monument and more like a living witness, a place that had finally spoken after generations of silence. And like all living things, it could heal, but only if someone remembered. Inside, Clara had stacked the diaries, ledgers, and family records in the library. Not hidden, but arranged, labeled, and open. She had created a space for truth, not legacy. Her family had told itself stories to survive, and in doing so, they had buried the truth so deep the walls had to scream it out. She wouldn't let that happen again. As she walked through the house, she paused at the places that once filled her with unease. The mirror where the girls had appeared was now just a mirror. Her reflection met her gaze without distortion. The hidden corridor was still there, but the objects had vanished. No lock of hair, no echo of memory, only smooth, empty shelves. Like the house had finally exhaled. The trapdoor in the basement was shut now, but Clara didn't need to go down again. What had been buried was no longer forgotten. Still, questions lingered like faint shadows, things she would never fully understand. Who built the tunnel? How far back did this pattern go? Were there others the house hadn't shown her? But not all stories need perfect closure. Some need only to be heard. Clara packed her bags slowly. She would return home, to her apartment, her job, her ordinary life, but she wouldn't leave this house behind. Not completely. She had already contacted a historical preservation group and submitted the documents. She would tell Elisa's story, and Louisa's, and Miriam's, all of them, before she left. Clara stood once more at the attic window. From this height, she could see the whole property, the fields, the trees, the winding road that led her here. In the far corner of the yard, the old oak tree swayed gently. Beneath its roots, if the diary was to be believed, Elise had once carved her name, a claim to memory, a quiet rebellion. She would visit that tree before she left. Descending the staircase, Clara paused at the front door and looked back. The house was quiet. Watching, she stepped outside. The grass crunched beneath her boots as she crossed the yard, the morning air thick with dew. She knelt beneath the oak tree and brushed aside a layer of moss and leaves. There was faint but still visible Yem, etched into the bark, weathered by time. She smiled and ran her fingers across the letters. "I remember you," she whispered. A sudden gust of wind stirred the branches above. The leaves rustled in reply, not loud, not eerie, just present. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. She turned back toward the house one last time, half expecting to see someone in the window, but it stood empty, calm. It had said what it needed to say. As she walked to her car, a voice, soft, almost indistinct, drifted to the wind behind her. "Thank you." She paused, eyes stinging with tears, and looked back. The house remained still. She got in, started the engine, and drove away. But she carried it all with her. The house, Elise, the girls who had never been given names, the women who had lived and died in silence. She would not forget them. And because of that, because she had chosen to listen, to see, to remember, the house no longer had to scream. It could rest. And so could they.